Greetings, fellow humans. Katrina here. Quick disclaimer, I'm a professional, not your professional. Nothing I'm about to say should be taken as medical, legal, or otherwise advice. This podcast is purely for education and amusement. That is it. Disclaimer over. So today I thought I'd talk a bit about what I don't know about emotions. And after reading this book I'm about to tell you about, I don't know about emotions more than I thought I did. So this book that I read and that I'm rereading, and I highly recommend, no affiliation, but it is called Atlas of the Heart by the wonderful Brene Brown. So Brene Brown is this shame researcher, and she's done a lot of work over the last, I don't know, 20 years in the shame research area. And one of the things that she did in writing this book was she listened to her interns. So in the introduction part of the book, it talks about some of the influences and appreciated people and all that stuff. But it mentions that the interns were confused when she wanted to list the emotions alphabetically. So instead of listing them alphabetically, she grouped them into categories. And each of her chapters are basically places we go when. And so she coupled different emotions when we go different places. And those categories, I'll go ahead and read those to you now. Places we go when things are uncertain or too much, and places we go when we compare, when things don't go as planned, when it's beyond us, when things aren't what they seem, when we're hurting, when we're with others, when we fall short, when we search for connection, when the heart is open, when life is good, when we feel wronged, and finally, places we go to self-assess. And so I want to dig a little bit deeper into each of these, but I'll let you know now that I don't know as much about each of these emotions as Brene Brown does in her book. And actually, listened rather to the Audible version. And in the Audible version, she actually says stuff like, well, this isn't in the book, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you. And I just think that's really cool because then you get even more information for the price of just the book. So the places we go when things are uncertain or too much. You can probably guess at that first one, stress. So she actually lists stress, overwhelm, anxiety, worry, avoidance, excitement, dread, fear, and vulnerability. It might be interesting to note here, excitement is on that same list with anxiety when things are uncertain or too much. Have you ever been so excited you just shake? Sometimes we get so excited that we have the same physiological reactions as if it was anxiety. The shaking, the increased heart rate, maybe even a shortness of breath. It's kind of different sometimes for different people, but excitement and anxiety, according to the research that I've done, is not physiologically different. It is our interpretation of that sensation that makes it either a pleasant emotion like excitement or unpleasant like anxiety. That was just a little tangent. Places we go when we compare. So the things that she lists here are comparison, admiration, reverence, envy, jealousy, resentment, Schadenfreude, and Fraudenfreude. And if you didn't understand those last two, don't worry, that's German. So let me explain for a moment. Sometimes we have the concept of an emotion that doesn't necessarily have a word for it. So in English, we don't have a word for taking joy in somebody else's misfortune. German does. Schadenfreude. So Schadenfreude is taking pleasure in somebody else's misfortune or discomfort or that kind of thing. Now, the opposite of that, taking joy in somebody else's joy, that's Fraudenfreude. And that is not one that I had heard of prior to reading this book. So Fraudenfreude, while not as common as Schadenfreude, is also out there and able to be experienced, even though we don't have a word for that in the English language. So the places we go when things don't go as planned. When things don't go as planned, that can really stink. So we've got boredom, disappointment, expectations, regret, discouragement, resignation, and frustration. Next, we've got the places we go when it's beyond us. So totally beyond our comprehension sometimes. That's going to be awe, wonder, confusion, curiosity, interest, and surprise. I gotta say that I experienced awe when I stood at the top of a mountain in Austria and looked out at the horizon. It was just awe. And so that was a pretty cool one. I also had surprise when I experienced something beyond myself going to a foreign country again. I went to Ireland back in 2016 and I was totally surprised at the greenness that I saw in the grass. The green seemed like a different green for some reason. And it may have been a slightly different green, but I was surprised by that. Uh, Places we go when things aren't what they seem. So we can be a little bit, I guess triggered is the right word because trigger just means sparking an emotion. So when things aren't what they seem, we might experience amusement, bittersweetness, nostalgia, cognitive dissonance, which is where your mind is being like pulled in two different directions, paradox, irony, and finally, sarcasm. Moving on, the places we go when we're hurting, and there's a lot of different uncomfortable emotions, but that's different from when we're hurting. So she's talking about when we're hurting about something, I think. So that would be a good one to go read the book. Don't take what I say. I don't know what I'm talking about. So places we go when we're hurting, anguish, hopelessness, despair, sadness, and grief. And the places we go with others. So we can have emotional experiences with others. And she lists compassion, pity. Some people confuse love and pity and tend to love people they can pity and rescue. Totally different topic. Empathy, sympathy, which are two different things. Google it. Boundaries, and comparative suffering. I was not familiar with comparative suffering in the way that she explains it. And actually, she explains it in a podcast. So I'll put in the references, the link to the podcast. But she says, without thinking, we start to rank our suffering and use it to deny or give ourselves permission to feel some type of way. So for example, comparative suffering can look like this. I can't be angry and afraid about being sick right now because there are people sicker than I. I can't be scared for my children because there are homeless kids who have nowhere to sleep at night. Or finally, why should I be tired and angry? I have a job right now and so many people don't. That's comparative suffering. So the places we go when we fall short, these are pretty uncomfortable. And that's going to be shame, self-compassion, perfectionism, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. Now, I got to say that I didn't realize that perfectionism was a form of an emotion. I thought that was more of a behavioral thing when we're trying to do something perfect, and sometimes that can inhibit our ability to do it at all. But trying to get something right or not doing it at all is what I kind of thought perfectionism was. But I guess it can be an emotional experience too. Learn something new even as I'm reading this. Now, I do want to mention shame and guilt. Those are the places we go when we fall short. And she likes to differentiate in a different text. I can't remember which book she differentiated guilt and shame from. Oh, I do remember now. It was called I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't by Brene Brown. And she says that shame is I am bad, whereas guilt is I've done something bad. So, like, violated our moral code in some type of way. Next, places we go when we're searching for connection. So connection with others is a necessary necessary to the human experience, in my opinion. But the places we go when we search for connection include belonging, fitting in, connection, disconnection sometimes, insecurity, invisibility, and loneliness. Notice not all of those are comfortable, but in order to get that belonging and fitting in, we sort of risk sometimes the insecurities that might come along with that. You got to kind of weigh the risk versus benefit. And I totally think it's worth it to make those connections and have friends. So the places we go when the heart is open: love, lovelessness, heartbreak, trust, self-trust, betrayal, defensiveness, flooding and hurt. Let me explain flooding real quick. At least to my best understanding, flooding is when you have like a surge of all of the emotions all at once, and it floods you. That's why that word exists. But it's a very uncomfortable thing to occur. So you'll notice that when the heart is open, you get those pleasant ones. You get that love, you get that trust, that self-trust, but you risk experiencing heartbreak, the flooding, the betrayal, the hurt. I think that is a risk I am willing to take because emotions are temporary. And if I did experience one of those unpleasant ones, I know that it would pass. Places we go when life is good. So this is another thing that you get from being vulnerable is that you get the really good emotions, or not that they're good emotions, they're the more pleasant emotions. So when life is good, joy, happiness, calm, contentment, gratitude, foreboding joy, relief, and tranquility. Next is the places we go when we feel wronged. These are, in my opinion, the pretty uncomfortable emotions. We've got anger, contempt, disgust, dehumanization, hate, and self-righteousness. Finally, the places we go to self-assess. Those are going to be things like pride and humility, and also hubris. And I had to Google hubris because that's a word I haven't heard very often, maybe in a book here or there. But it is exaggerated pride or self-confidence. All right, so this is all from BrenéBrown.com. You can look at the 87 human emotions and experiences based on the research of Atlas of the Heart. And I highly recommend you buying that book. Any of her books really are really good. Again, no affiliation. I just love this woman. So if you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and click the button on the website to support the show. And remember, I appreciate each and every one of you simply for existing.